Anatomy, it's Miss Satterley here. I'm going to talk about body cavities. So, what is a body cavity? A body cavity is a fluid-filled space inside the body that holds and protects body organs. Two major functions of body cavities include protecting organs and permitting change in size. So, your body cavities, the fluids within them, it allows you to breathe, change position, it's still keeping your organs safe. Now, how it protects the organs is it helps protect from accidental shock, or it cushions your organs from bumps, or if you run into something, if you maybe get into an accident, it takes a lot of force to injure those organs, and that's because your body cavities are designed to help protect anything that's in them. Now, let's talk about the two major classifications of body cavities. That includes the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. Now, the dorsal body cavity is on the dorsal side, which we've learned that is the back side. The dorsal body cavity surrounds the brain and spinal cord. It's a fluid-filled space. It actually has a special fluid called cerebral spinal fluid that's not found anywhere else in your body, so it's very unique. Now, space is limited in the dorsal body cavity. You only have the cranium and the vertebral arches that house the spinal cord. So it's not a lot of movement, not a lot of extra room, which is good because you don't want your brain and spinal cord to have a lot of room to move because you want to make sure it's secure and it stays in place. Now, let's just talk about the dorsal body cavity is actually split into two, the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. Now, cranial makes me think of cranium. Actually, cranial is a body region that we've already learned, which we know is skull for cranium. And then the spinal cavity makes me think of spinal cord, which is what houses inside of it. So the cranial cavity encloses the brain, and the spinal cavity surrounds the spinal cord. Now let's talk about the ventral body cavity. It's much more complex than the dorsal body cavity, and there's a lot more going on. Ventral means front or belly, so you know that anything in the ventral body cavity is going to be on the front side of the body. The ventral body cavity is a cavity that contains all of the organs in the torso. It's also called the colon. There's different types of colons, but we're not going to get into that. But a colon is a fluid-filled space. Now it surrounds developing organs. Organs that are found in the respiratory system, cardiovascular, digestive, urinary, and reproductive systems. All of those organs are housed inside the ventral body cavity. Now the diaphragm is important for a lot of reasons, but what your diaphragm does, it's a flat muscular sheet that helps you breathe. It expands and contracts your thoracic cavity, which we'll get to help you breathe. But it has another function in this case. It actually divides the ventral body cavity into a superior and inferior part. The superior is called the thoracic cavity, and then the inferior is the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the ventral body cavity is broken up into these two major branches, the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic. Now, the thoracic cavity is superior to the diaphragm. It consists of the chest wall, and it surrounds the lungs, heart, esophagus, and thymus. Now, the abdominal pelvic cavity is inferior to the diaphragm. It holds the abdomen that has lots of organs and also the pelvis. Viscera are internal organs that project into body cavities, and they are surrounded by serous membranes. Now, different serous membranes are going to have different terms that we use based on the organ that they cover and whether they cover the cavity or the organ itself. Now, the pericardial cavity is the membrane that encloses the heart. It lies within the mediastinum. The serous membrane name that we use for the pericardial cavity is called the pericardium. The pericardium is split up into two types of pericardiums, the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. So visceral makes me think of viscera that we just went over, and viscera means organs, which means the visceral pericardium is going to be the layer that covers the heart itself. Now, the parietal pericardium is the counterpart to that, and that's actually the layer that lines the cavity. So in between these two layers, you're actually going to have fluid, and that helps lubricate movement between the visceral and parietal pericardiums. Now let's get to the mediastinum. The mediastinum is a portion of the thoracic cavity that lies between the two pleural cavities. Pleural actually means lung, and we'll get to that next. The mediastinum surrounds the heart, large arteries and veins, thymus, trachea, and esophagus. So all of these are found within the mediastinum, which is in the center of the thoracic cavity. The pleural cavity is the cavity that encloses the lungs. It's located on the sides of the mediastinum. Pleura means lungs, like I just said. So what do you think our membranes might be named? Well, pleura, of course. We have the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. The visceral pleura is the layer that covers the lungs. Remember, viscera means organ, so I know visceral pleura is going to cover the lungs. Now, parietal pleura is a layer that lines the cavity. It actually lines the body wall of the cavity, but it also lines the mediastinum on the outside as well. So those are your two membranes that are found within the pleural cavity. Okay, let's get to the abdominal pelvic. The abdominal pelvic cavity is divided into the superior abdominal cavity and the inferior pelvic cavity, and they contain the peritoneal cavity. So the peritoneal cavity, what is that? That's the internal cavity that is enclosed in the abdominal pelvic cavity. It's an internal chamber lined by a serous membrane called the peritoneum. It actually is separated by fluid. You have the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. So again, the parietal is going to cover the outside and the visceral is going to cover the organs. I just said this, but the visceral peritoneum covers the enclosed organs and the parietal covers the body wall. The abdominal cavity extends from the inferior surface of the diaphragm to the lowest spinal vertebra, which is where the pelvis is going to begin. It contains the liver, the spleen, stomach, kidney, pancreas, small intestine, and large intestine. Now, these are all of the organs involved in our digestive system. The pelvic cavity is inferior to the abdominal cavity, and it is enclosed by the pelvis. It's going to contain parts of the large intestine, the bladder, and reproductive organs. This is the last slide for today. I hope this was informative. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks.